We are very proud to have Mr. Najib Jung, the Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia, and also the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi to be here this morning. And I'm grateful to him who agreed to deliver a talk on governance in India. On behalf of the ISS, I once again congratulate Najib Jung for his elevation as the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. Mr. Najib Jung, he's an internationally known expert on energy. He joined the Indian Administrative Service in 1973 and worked in various capacities in Madhya Pradesh and with the Government of India, serving as District Magistrate, Managing Director of 2 public sector companies, and Joint Secretary, Exploration in the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas before quitting to pursue his PhD in Energy Economics from Oxford University. Mr. Jung played a crucial role in the privatization of ONGC's Panna Mukta oil field that went to the consortium of Reliance ONGC and British. Jung also did a 7-year stint as Senior Advisor Energy with the Asian Development Bank. The St. Stephen graduate completed his Master in History from DU, followed by MA in Social Policy and Planning in Developing Countries from the London School of Economics, UK. While he was a senior visiting fellow and research scholar at the Oxford University Energy Studies, Oxford University, he was appointed Jamia VC in September 2009. With him at the helm, the university received minority status and started new courses and center. It has also rid itself of decade-old encroachments. Outside his official role, Jung has been a respected voice on a number of issues. He has advocated modern education for Muslims. Jung has published several monographs and reports on the energy sector and has been the chairman of a core committee of Vice Chancellor appointed by the Human Resource Ministry to examine various aspects of higher education, chairman of committee to review the existing scheme for enhancing participation of minorities in higher education, and member of the special task force set up by the Home Ministry to suggest development option for Jammu region. I once again welcome Najib Jung Sahab to be in the department and request him to deliver his lecture. Thank you, sir.
First tell me, I haven't prepared any lecture, so I want to meet all of you. Will you introduce yourselves from where you are and what you have done, what is your background?
I am Hassan from Syria. I study law.
From?
Syria. I study law.
You study law there? How many years of law?
Just 1 year. I stopped because of the war.
I'm Munira and I'm from Delhi. I have just completed a master's in social work from Jamia.
My name is Shah. I just finished my law from Jamia Millia Islamia.
Finished?
Yeah, yes.
Are you practicing?
No. I just had my exams last month.
I am Dunya from Turkmenistan, student of Jamia doing MA Psychology.
You live in Ashgabat?
I'm Saif from Iraq. I'm doing my PhD in the University of Delhi, Linguistics.
In what's your topic?
Linguistics. Linguistics.
My name is Khalid. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Political Science. I'm from Delhi.
From Jamia?
Yes, from
PhD in
Jamia.
Jamia. Topic?
India's foreign policy towards Israel.
My name is Champel. I'm from Bhutan.
My name is David and I'm from Australia and I study history.
Which year? Have you finished your BA?
I have finished my undergraduate and now I'm studying an honours year.
I'm Shubhangi. I'm from Bangalore. I'm doing my master's in public administration from Jammu.
Sir, I'm Afreen. I'm from Jammu. I'm pursuing my master's in public administration from Jammu.
I'm Meena from Japan. My name is Tanya. I'm in Bhutan and I study pharmacy.
My name is Joseph. I'm from South Africa and I'm doing my final year BA in politics and philosophy.
In South Africa?
South Africa.
Which place?
Johannesburg.
I'm just here from Japan. I study sociology.
I'm Jun. I'm from Australia and I'm finishing up my last year of a BA in LLB.
I'm Kyoki from Japan and I study IT.
Good morning.
name is Amar. I'm from Morocco. I'm a journalist. I'm based here for almost a year now. Before that, I worked in Safar.
Who are you? Who are you writing for?
Well, a news agency.
Good morning, sir. Congratulations. I'm Gausia from Political Science Department. I'm basically from Kashmir. I've just completed my graduation from the same department.
You know, you're such an interesting group here. So I thought rather than my talking to you and giving you any kind of a lecture, which you're getting enough of, I'm sure, every day, why don't we have a conversation? If you have questions about India, about Indian history, about what's going on in India, as compared to your own country, your own experiences, I'm happy to answer them. So one question leads to dialogue, and that would be probably more interesting. So, you know, you've been around for 2 weeks now? So what are your experiences of this place? What are their ambitions? What are their desires for India, for life ahead?
So this international summer school, it's entirely different from what we actually pursue our courses in Jamia. Like I study in the same department, but sitting in the same classroom, it's entirely different. You're interacting with people. Earlier you just used to discuss, like in classrooms, you used to read books about history or about various countries, like comparative politics of different countries. But now you're practically somehow, you know, talking about it to the people who are really coming from those particular countries. So it in itself is like an amazing experience.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. I don't know what the others feel. I don't know what the foreigners feel.
Yeah, I want to share one of my experience here while being 2 weeks on the campus. It's interesting to find because while being outside, I was like in India since 2007. I finished my MA here and my MPhil and now second year PhD. But I rarely came to this campus. So as an outsider, I was like, I have an idea that Jamia Millia is an Islamic university and mainly Muslims are there. But it's not the case actually while being in this campus and while studying in this school. I discovered that it's a metropolitan university where many people from different ethnicities are found here. So it's interesting because, you know, being the name as Islamic University, Jamia Millia Islamia embeds or carries this notion. So it's not the case.
You know, what you say is true for most circumstance, because as human beings, we form our impressions based on gossip, on innuendo, on newspaper reports, on impressions. So, well as the reality might be completely different. And that's a very good example that we have been reading in the press lately, you know, of violence in Turkey, for instance, what was happening in that square. But I have had friends passing through Turkey and living in a hotel just next to the square. And they said, you know, the demonstration was completely peaceful, there was no such things, whereas the international press had made out as if Turkey was going to go up in flames. Now, those are impressions, and that's a very important thing which you have said, that I believe that as you guys grow up and you get into your work situations, it's an old quote that verify and then believe, because it is very possible for us, and it's for the rest of the world, that you start believing things that you repeatedly hear. You know, a lie spoken 1,000 times becomes the truth. A very good example, which I was telling the press yesterday, was there is, you know, a general impression amongst a lot of people that various governments in India tend to do appeasement for Muslims for political reasons. And it has come to be accepted parlance even amongst the more educated and secular people. But if you look at facts, what the government of India tries is not appeasement, but what should be called, affirmative action. Because as anywhere in the world, in the educated world, it is incumbent on government to care for people who are from weaker side of society. So if you live in America, you will find that the American state is very sympathetic to African Americans, because if they would not be, then how does the community lift itself? We in India, because a lot of you are from outside, we have had a caste system in India. And because of that caste system, one caste lost favor in society, what we now call Dalits. It's a very large section of Indian society, almost 16-17%. So when India became independent and they decided to have a constitution, they said that there should be a positive gesture towards these castes that have been denied rights over last 6,000 years. So what the government did was give them, reservations in government jobs to make sure that these people start coming into government, into the education system. Again, it is a necessary thing for government to do. But unfortunately, many people will say, no, this is bad. Why should there be reservations? That's a view people will have, that there are not enough jobs going around. So if you have reservations, I'm being denied a job. But the fact of the matter is that it is necessary for any government to have this sensitivity to the poorest of the poor and the weakest of the weak. Anything else? Yeah, please.
I was just, thank you very much for coming to talk to us this morning. I was just listening to your career so far, and I noticed that you've done a lot of work in the energy fields. And I suppose I just wanted to know, considering even last week, John Kerry said that India's first priority is growth and alleviation from poverty, or something along those lines. But in Australia, a huge discussion that we're having around the world, especially in China and America at the moment, is climate change. So I was wondering what your opinion on that, and what role you should take it.
Obviously India is a very large country, and therefore it has to show responsibility towards climate change. India is also being very adversely impacted by changes in climate. I mean, we've had the most horrendous calamity in the last 10 days. It's thanks to our fault, because we have been very callous towards our own environment. The destruction of environment, truly speaking, the responsibility largely lies, the footprint of destruction largely lies with the developed world. I mean, we must understand that the level of pollution that would be caused in the United States would be, light years more than what the developing world is capable of having at the moment. But having said that, the developing world cannot today say that, look, you've destroyed the world, we will continue doing so. So India is very sensitive, but India continues to make mistakes. And the reason that the developing world makes mistakes is because of the desire to develop quickly. Everyone wants that big car. Everybody wants a house. And you get that only when you have the power of industry behind you, when the manufacturing industry in your country is strong, when the manufacturing base becomes strong, then your export industry becomes strong. And all that adversely impacts the climate. In the energy sector, of course, there are clean sources of energy, for instance, natural gas. So we don't have to use the uncleaner version, which is, let us say, coal. In Australia, you have very good quality coal. For instance, the ash content of your coal is about 6%. The ash content of Indian coal is 36%. So there's a world of a difference, and therefore in Australia you're naturally blessed that even when you use coal, you're not adversely impacting climate so much. Whereas we, who do not have oil and gas to the extent that we need, are forced to use substantial quantity of Indian coal, which is not very clean. Now this is the catch-22. What do we do? Should they stop growing? Or should they be dependent on clean fuel, which means oil and gas? And if that is so, then where do you find the resources for importing that quantity of oil and gas? We have not been so far. You know, we have some 170,000 miles of sedimentary basins where we believe there should be oil and gas deposits. Unfortunately, you can have oil and gas deposit, but it may not be easily accessible to you. Technology may not be there. Now, if we go into the deeper ocean, which is the deeper parts of the Indian Ocean, we need technology which is extremely expensive. So it is easier to import than to have technology of the kind to go that deep into the Indian Ocean. We can, for instance, import gas from Iran under the sea, by undersea pipeline. The problem is that the Indian continental shelf takes a steep drop in the Arabian coast, and the drop is almost 3,000 meters. So 3 kilometers beneath the water, it's very difficult to lay a gas pipeline because the pressure of the water would break the pipe. So these are many factors which go against us. We haven't been blessed by nature. So it's really a catch-22. And so India continues to struggle. And no one will be able to give you a straight answer that this is what we should do. Had Indian growth been sustained, say, at 20% as in China, for the last 20 years, Chinese growth has been going at 20% GDP for the last 20 years now. If we were able to sustain that pace of growth, then we would be able to afford importing energy. And we don't have that pace of growth at the moment. So India is really caught in a quagmire, and there are no solutions in sight.
I suppose just as a follow-up to that then, one solution that I know has been popular, especially last year, was nuclear energy.
Yep.
Australia was offering to sell uranium to India. I was just thinking, what's your opinion on that then, I suppose, with Germany's reaction after the disaster in Japan and everything, where they closed down all of their nuclear sites and they're only just rebuilding them in Japan now?
No, look, I don't think we have an alternative but to look at that option, number one. Number two, the fear of accidents always exists. But today there is enough technology and enough reliable technology that accidents do not happen. To put the Chernobyl disaster, in front of us and say that we should not go for nuclear energy is rubbish. If you look at France, 80-90% of the energy or 70% of the energy comes from nuclear sources. I'm sure a large percentage of your energy comes from nuclear sources. So we will finally have no option but to look at nuclear options, except that uranium also is very expensive.
I want to ask first, what's your priority? I don't know exactly what's the job of the lieutenant governor is, but what are your priorities during the afternoon? And since one of the challenges for Delhi is energy and security, especially for young women, and one of the issues that the media will dealing with is rape cases. I don't know if it's just a myth or reality again. As a father of 3 daughters yourself, do you feel that the city is safe, or is this issue would be one of your main priorities?
See, the job of the Lieutenant Governor in Delhi is very different from jobs of governors in rest of the states. And the reason is that we have 22 states or something. 22 or 21? How many states we have now?
20.
I think 22 now, huh?
28.
So those states have elected assemblies with chief ministers. It's a full state assembly. the Delhi Assembly the Delhi state has not been given full statehood. So there is an assembly with curtailed powers. So the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi actually is head of the law and order of Delhi and the land usage of Delhi. So development of land, planning of land, doing this great master plan for future growth, that lies with the Lieutenant Governor, not with the elected government. Delhi has always had, not from now, but since I was a child, an issue with men's relationships with women. When we were growing up in 50s, you know, it was common talk that women in Bombay are much safer. You can walk in Marine Drive at 12 o'clock at night and you are safe. That you can, you know, go to the Marina Beach in Chennai in the afternoon and you are completely safe. Whereas in Delhi, in the Delhi buses, women feel, you know, that they are being brushed up and the people will paw you and go close to you and look at you and so on and so forth. So it's unfortunate that civil society, because the administration has a peripheral role, civil society itself has not been able to handle this issue of caring enough for women. The incident of 16 December is an incident which takes place once in 2 decades, once in 3 decades. It's not a normal thing, but it is a very unfortunate incident. And it reflects the frustration of the people, because over the years people have been witnessing this harassment and the lack of ability of the administration to handle that harassment, that bubbled across. You must understand also that, you know, you saw on cameras police's adverse reaction, and for any sensible person it was not nice to look at. But there is another aspect which you as concerned citizens must be aware of, which is that policing is a very difficult task. Policing in Asian conditions is a very difficult task, because the policeman leaves his home at 6 in the morning, 6:30 in the morning. He is living in pretty tough conditions. They don't get adequate housing. And when he comes on the job, and he's on the job for 8, 10, 12 hours, you know, faced with a crowd, it's a crowd which abuses them, crowd which pushes them, which jostles with them. There is a point when policemen tend to get rash. And that is something which happened then. Can we avoid it? Of course we can. We can avoid it by training them better. We can avoid it by giving them better living conditions. We can avoid it by giving them better education. Again, in a developed world, you know, you had problems in Australia, in Sydney, when there was those racial riots, for instance, 3-4 years ago.
A very similar case happened last year.
Yeah. Yeah. But in Sydney, it is an aberration. In India, unfortunately, now it is not such an aberration. We have too many people. There are more such instances. I think all of us need to you know, raise our hands and accept this accountability, that civil society, police, government, all of us have to be responsible for looking after, for thinking of women's safety. You pass by a road, you see a woman being harassed, I think people should react. People shouldn't keep quiet. We have tried in this university at least to have, you know, zero tolerance towards, I mean, I remember about 3 years ago, it was, I think, your department, Nisar, only this department, where we had a case of 2 boys SMSing a girl. You know, the usual silly SMSs that boys can do. But I was left with no alternative but to expel them. And the result is that I really believe that things improved. Now, obviously, it has not ended. It can't end, because you are all of such young age that you're bound to use this medium of contacting girls, or vice versa. But we can reduce harassment to the maximum possible by taking very, very stringent action.
I wanted to ask, as your experience as a bureaucrat, how do you advise that we balance the national interest and the interest of tribal groups in context of development?
You know, it's been a very, very painful exercise for India, and we haven't met with the success that we should have when we think of development of the scheduled tribes. India started with the concept of a separate sub-plan for tribes. A sub-plan means that part of the budget is dedicated to the tribal welfare. So if there is a big budget, an overall budget where, Jamia would get part of the money from the overall budget of India, the scheduled tribes have a special budget. It's called a sub-plan, which is carved out for them. So they will have a budget for education, they will have a budget for welfare, for housing, for roads, and so on. And that started, I think, in mid-60s. So monies were spent. But the benefits, I don't know. Because there's a big debate on how do you develop an Adivasi. For your information, Adivasi is our local lingo for a tribal. So how do we develop Adivasis? Is modern development what we need? Or their way of life and culture should be preserved? That we should respect thousands of years of culture where they have lived in their natural habitats quite happily? But that's the debate. Do you want a man to live in the jungle with good necessities and not bring him to the cities? Or should he come to the cities and then go back with new ideas which adversely impact his own old culture? It's a debate. We have not come up with good answers. So what is happening is that they have tried to develop roads. They have tried to build peripheral schools. They have also tried to build some colonies where these people, lands can be allocated, etc. But it has not proved successful because I think it has become more of an intrusion in their way of life. Also, whenever you go and try to develop those areas, you go and start mining. What happens? The Adivasi goes deeper into the jungle. He was living here happily. Suddenly you are building up a steel factory. This man is forced to go further deeper into the forest. The forest officer goes and says, this is government land, you can't cultivate it anymore. The Adivasi says, sorry, my family has been doing it for thousands of years, how has this become government land? Those are issues we have not been able to tackle the way we should have. And that is the reason why we have the so-called Maoist or Naxal problem. There is a desire to handle it, but the success has been very peripheral. If we have given them political voice, you have Adivasi leaders emerging, even from Chhattisgarh, from Jharkhand, and so on. But the same old problem. The man becomes a political leader and comes to the state assembly, and he forgets his people. He lives in those big bungalows, he becomes a minister, and he loses interest in his own people. A tribal teacher who is supposed to be teaching in those schools takes a government job and forgets his job for teaching. Now, those are values which are missing. So again, like in the case of energy, there are no straightforward, easy answers. I think it's a matter of time. It's a matter of India taking a step back and rededicating itself.
So before my question, I would like to tell one and all about the sexual harassment. As you said, there is not even a single percent sexual harassment in Jamia, which I felt I have been a student right from 2010. And Jamia gives so many rights to the female students of Jamia that they can drag the person to the proctor's office and the next day the person gets expelled. So now my question, so being a lieutenant governor, do you have some resolutions as in what all changes you're planning to bring in the capacity of a lieutenant governor?
No, that's not a practical thing to have resolutions in government. But the task is very clear. And any administrator, in all honesty, must say this, that administration doesn't create revolutions. So it is not that you are going to clean up the system in 2 months' time, 3 months' time, and it's going to improve, and suddenly Delhi will become as good as New York in policing. But there are enough opportunities to do a reasonable job. I think in government you have huge opportunities to do a reasonable job to the best of your ability, and the Indian political system gives you the space to do it. So one would like to, as a priority, look at law and order issues straight away. There are issues relating to, of course, to women. There are issues of a sensitive communal nature in Delhi, which have to be looked at. There are consistent disputes, between lands belonging to communities and communities fighting over it. There are issues where illegal colonies have come up. But do you remove those colonies ruthlessly, or do you do it with sensitivity? After all, if somebody is living somewhere and he doesn't want to live illegally, but he's made a house because we did not give him the opportunity to earn a living and buy a house. So where does the man go and live? Can you sit in this class and say, Kasab, you cannot go and make a house in X place. If I find a place and I have nowhere else to go, what do I do? So if you have to resettle people, we must settle them with sensitivity. Make sure that their culture is not adversely impacted. Please also remember that shifting people is a very, very difficult, it's a very, very harsh process. We have the caste system here. You take a person from this place and take him to that place in the middle of another caste, he dies a natural death. So those are issues which administration must be sensitive about and always keep in mind. So I have no resolutions, but the desire is to, to work as sincerely as possible and possibly make an impact. The problem becomes that once students get elected, number one, the first years and second years will never get elected. What happens is that it's people in their MPhils and masters and PhDs who will get elected. They are of an age which is 25, 26. And suddenly once elected over this body which has 20,000 students, people nurture political ambitions. It becomes a training ground for being a future MLA in your state, carving out an influence. And unfortunately what has happened in India is that to make your impact felt in a university, you resort to violence, or at least means which are not entirely conducive to harmonious existence. So Jamia has had a very bad history, that whenever there have been student bodies here, there has been a spate of violence, and what happens within a year, you call in the police and the student body is suspended, and then cases are put on students and their lives are spoiled. The last student body, for instance, in 2006, they entered that Vice Chancellor's complex and burnt cars and destroyed paintings. Some of our most precious arts were destroyed. And there was an incident of firing. The result is that those students, because the police came and registered cases, those cases are now in court. Now those boys who were then 24 are about 30 years old, 32 years old. They can't find jobs. They are in court. They are likely to be convicted because they had firearms with them. So they have lost a life for, this one day of silly violence where they were trying to become popular. So our history, unfortunately, has not been very palatable. What we have proposed to do, and we have suggested that, because some gentleman has gone to court, is that department-wise hold the election. Not this university-wide hold the election where, people are going around in jeeps and having public meetings, but have an election department-wise. And once you have the election, it's an election, not a nomination. Once you have an election department-wise, then those elected nominees from the department should get together and choose faculty-wise nomination. So you have 9 faculties. Suppose you have two representatives from each faculty, you will have 18 people in your body, plus you have some, 24 centers, some centers are not affiliated. So let us say 25 people. And of those 25 people can get together and elect a president, a vice president, treasurer, whatever you want. So it becomes an election, but it's more on the Swiss model, that it's an indirect election of a type that smaller bodies are electing people, rather, because moment you have the election on the university scale, then you will have the Congress party, the BJP, the Samajwadi party, all, pumping up and piping up, priming up students, giving them money on the election. And what you will actually get elected is not a boy who's interested in student welfare, but a chap who's representing his political party.
So I have a question. So where do you see Jamia 5 years or 10 years down the lane in its educational system and co-curricular activities as well?
You see, Jamia has a huge potential. I have no doubt about it. There are two issues here. One is that a large segment of our students who come from, rural areas. And so we need to brush up their social skills the moment they come. We have to start making sure that in the first year or by the second year, they are more confident in their English and etc. So that gives a fillip to their confidence. The thing that has been missing in Jamia is quality research from its teachers. And unless that happens, no university can improve its reputation. So a lot will depend. Now what has happened is that why our research suffered is the old system of recruitment where people were coming from here and there and finding a job. What we have done in the last 3-4 years is that you come, there is a recruitment system which is very stiff, and only the best will get selected. So I believe in 5 years you will have teachers of good quality, committed to research and teaching, and with a course curriculum which will encourage personality development. A combination of that, you should be as good or as bad as any other university in Delhi.
What you dreamed in Turkmenistan and what you saw in Jamia and how you felt about it?
I mean, India was my dream really. And when I came, I was disappointed that I didn't expect India like this. And I dreamed about Indian people like energetic, everything's friendly. Like when I came, I found very completely different. And then even I tried to go back, but I didn't stay, and I can't just go. I found what I was searching in this school. I learned what is real Indian.
I think you say is true. First, let me tell you my experience of Ashgabat. Because it is a very fearful experience. Getting into your immigration, they take away your passport for hours. Yeah? And you don't know when it's coming back. And I went when Turkmenbashi was there. So it was a complete dictatorship. So you saw this white, sanitized place, but we were concerned that there was no freedom. And I was dealing in the petroleum sector in those days. And the ministers used to disappear because it was such a tough dictatorship. Now, your experience of India is what many people feel. And it is really a shame, because that is one reason why India has not been able to develop its tourism sector. You see, if you look at it from outside, you would imagine that we would have the maximum tourists in the world, but we don't. And the reason is that the moment you emerge out of the international airport, you are faced with a sea of humanity which does not seem so friendly. In your case, I don't know, but there are beggars, there are touts, changing of currency is an issue, the taxi driver wants to fleece you. And these are the most common experiences which India has proved completely inept to handle. So there are two experiences. One is that India, where you have these touts and these travel agents and etc., etc. There is the other India which you will feel that people are friendly and people are nice and people want to welcome you. The better side has not been able to win over the weaker side. It is an issue which India has debated constantly, and I really think that change will happen when there is better education, when there is more economic growth. If you're a poor person, then if you are a tout, you don't feel guilty about it. This is the whole issue. That does a thief who is starving feel bad about taking somebody's money who he thinks is rich? It's also a moral and a philosophical question. We are not able to help the poorest of the poor cross this barrier of, infinite, unending poverty. Until we cross that barrier, we will continue to struggle. So I fully understand where you are coming from and your feelings. And I'm glad you felt that way. Because the next time you come to India, you will feel more comfortable. You would have seen its weaknesses and you would have seen its strengths. Because
I'm feeling sorry, but I'm feeling comfortable now
Yeah.
also. It's
Yeah.
like it's become like my land also. I really love India. I didn't change my mind. I really love India.
Yeah.
Yeah, people first time was different, but not now.
Yeah.
I found very good people, very good friends. Before I didn't have friends with girl. Now I have a girl who is friends really.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what happens. That's what happens. But the ideal situation would be that India should have welcomed you from the airport itself. That is what the sign of a developed world is. You go, Turkey is not the developed world, but you go to Turkey, what you will find is that there is no harassment. You come out of the airport and you are fine. You can sit confidently in a taxi and the taxi is not going to fiddle with the meter. It will take you to that hotel where you are going to go. The sign of a developed country is clean toilets. We can't provide clean toilets. Those are stages we need to cross through. Yeah, now I need to rush, children, so one last question. I am late for my...
It's like no one is having a question, I'm having a personal question. Anybody having a question?
I'd like to know in terms of what is the relation between India and Africa and the perceptions of Africans that most Indians have, because during my time here I found contrasting views and I haven't been able to make a conclusive judgment as to what the relations are.
Unfortunately, like all Asian countries, the African continent is not so important in this Indian scheme of things. We don't do so much of business with you. That's one problem. We've had a very strong historical connection because of Gandhi. That Gandhi learnt his techniques and honed his skills of satyagraha and so on in South Africa. But after that, and despite the fact that there are Indians who are doing well in Africa and various parts of Africa, North Africa was always under the French influence and the Belgian and the French influence, so India had very little connection. Subsequent to the independence of all those countries, Indian businesses have really not evolved with Africa. Indian students don't go and study there. Indians have strong links with Britain and America because A, students want to go there, B, because people want to go and settle there. Indians do not have a strong link with Europe either because of the language limitation. You don't have this great desire of wanting to go and settle in Europe. So Africa is probably the same stage of our relationship as, say, Iran, Iraq, many of the European countries, and even the Far East. Because Indian comfort zone has been English-speaking, that English-speaking part of the world. So they would be much more attracted, say, to Canada, Australia, New Zealand than Africa, Vietnam, Philippines. Okay, I must go. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I'll see you before your course ends, I hope.